I bet you money it's a female because she had two.
When night falls over the vast grasslands of North America, the landscape seems to become unbelievably still. Yet within that stillness, an almost imperceptible movement begins. There is no roar, no chaos, only soft, steady, calculated footsteps. Wolves appear like shadows gliding across the terrain, observing the slightest changes, remembering every path they have once traveled. In regions such as Montana, Wyoming, or even the forest edges of Canada, the presence of wolves is no longer rare. At first, the signs are subtle. A displaced fence, a few tracks pressed into damp soil, or the disappearance of a single piece of livestock in the night. But over time, patterns begin to emerge. Not by chance. Wolves do not act impulsively. They observe, remember, and adjust their strategies night after night. The attacks do not begin with chaos. They begin with absence. One sheep disappears, then another. No clear traces, no loud disturbance. By the time ranchers recognize the pattern, things have already slipped beyond control. Wolves do not merely hunt, they solve problems. And each farm becomes a map they can read in their own way. Deal with such an organized predator. Fragmented approaches are almost ineffective. Temporary deterrents only cause them to shift direction, not disappear. Therefore, any control strategy must begin with something more fundamental: understanding behavior. This process does not start with setting traps, but with observation. Over consecutive days, infrared cameras are deployed along the trails wolves frequently use. Each recording is not just footage, but data: time of appearance, direction of movement, distance between individuals. Once the pattern becomes clear enough, the next step is implemented: setting steel foothold traps. Unlike easily noticeable cage traps, these are designed to blend seamlessly into the environment. Placement is not random, but at key intersections along travel routes, points wolves are almost certain to pass. Installation requires precision. The traps are buried shallowly beneath the soil, covered with dry leaves and natural debris to preserve the surface structure. Metallic scent is carefully treated to avoid detection. Every detail must disappear into the surroundings, because even the slightest anomaly can trigger suspicion and cause wolves to withdraw. But the most critical factor is not the trap, it is timing. If deployed too early, before wolves establish clear patterns, effectiveness remains low. If delayed too long, they may alter routes or expand their range. This balance demands both experience and patience. In many cases, capturing even a single individual can create significant change. Wolves have a tightly structured social system, and disruption within it can reduce their return frequency. However, this does not mean the process is complete. The remaining individuals quickly adapt, becoming more cautious, ranging farther, and growing increasingly unpredictable.
Just like this. Yep, you're night latched.
That is why control systems do not end after a single deployment. Trap locations are continuously adjusted.
I got to catch on video,
New
so I'll play that for you
data
right now.
is updated, and behavioral patterns are reanalyzed. This is not an immediate solution, but a long-term process, one in which humans must constantly adapt to the very adaptability of the animals.
Girls, gets on me. There we go. Get that right there down in the hole.
From another perspective, this story is not only about control. It is about balance. As the boundary between nature and human settlements becomes increasingly blurred, such encounters are inevitable. And in the silence of a night, when everything seems at rest, that confrontation continues, quiet, unseen, yet filled with tension. On one side is a survival instinct honed over thousands of years. On the other is calculation, patience, and the ability to interpret nature. There is no absolute victory, only adaptation and a boundary that is always shifting.
Losses exceeding $800,000 in a short period, enough to make any farmer hesitate. In just a few nights, entire flocks of poultry vanished, leaving behind cold, empty enclosures and chaotic traces scattered across the ground. No longer isolated incidents, this had become a series of coordinated attacks by wolves. As the damage continued to rise, many farms faced the risk of collapse. And a pressing question began to emerge: how would they fight back? At first, everything seemed like a minor nuisance. A few animals went missing, a few unfamiliar tracks appeared around the fences. But in a short time, the situation escalated rapidly. The predators began returning more frequently, following familiar paths, even identifying weaknesses in the protection systems. Some farms reported losing hundreds of animals in just 1 week. What was once a small issue had now turned into a full-blown crisis. Under mounting pressure, traditional defensive measures were immediately deployed. Fences were reinforced, protective nets were installed more densely, and warning devices were put into use. However, their effectiveness only lasted for a short time. The predators quickly adapted, changing their approach, even finding ways to bypass what seemed like the safest barriers. A true battle of wits began to take shape. When passive solutions were no longer enough, a more proactive approach was introduced: direct control through trapping. But this was far from an easy decision. The method has always been accompanied by intense debate over humaneness and safety. Some argue it is the only way to protect livelihoods, while others call for less controversial alternatives. Even so, in practice, control still had to be carried out. Experienced individuals began with observation. They did not set traps immediately but instead monitored signs, travel routes, footprints, and access points to water sources. From there, movement patterns gradually became clear. Trap locations were carefully selected, often along the routes most frequently used. The setup process was carried out with high precision. Traps were treated to minimize foreign scent, then buried just beneath the surface to avoid detection. Anchoring stakes were driven deep to ensure stability. Bait was placed strategically, often combining strong scents with natural cues to increase attraction. Every detail was carefully calculated, as even a small mistake could cause the entire plan to fail. Throughout the process, safety remained the top priority. Operators had to approach from the right direction, use gloves, and minimize leaving human traces. After traps were activated, regular inspections were required according to regulations to avoid unnecessary risks. This was not just a control activity, but a process demanding discipline and high responsibility. Over time, these efforts began to show results. The number of attacks gradually declined, and losses became more manageable. Some reports indicated a significant reduction in farm intrusions. At the same time, the number of participants in legal control efforts increased, showing that this was no longer an isolated effort but a coordinated system. As environments continue to change and wildlife adapts more rapidly, every method will need to evolve. Ultimately, the choice is not only about effectiveness, but also about how humans balance protecting livelihoods and maintaining ecosystems. If you were faced with this situation, what would you choose? A forceful solution to eliminate the risk immediately, or a softer approach that requires more time? Share your perspective, because this is not just the story of a single farm, but an issue spreading across many regions.